G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 8 of a multi-part series covering modeling for animation. In this video, we are going to model the clothes. And you might think that it's quite complicated, but in reality it isn't that bad. We aren't going to do any simulation, there's no fancy tricks, it's just pure modeling. And of course, here's what I made earlier. And as you can see, it is still in line with that stylized effect that I'm looking for. And that's not to say that you can't make realistic clothing with this method. It's just that for my particular model and my particular character, I need to make something that's a little less realistic. That being said, we still follow some principal edge flow logic going through the clothing. And again, it's not as difficult as you might think. So without any further hesitation, let's jump right in. And before we jump into making the clothes, I want to get this character into a more neutral position. And what I mean by that is turning the T pose of the character into an A pose. And this is great for both the clothing and rigging in the future. This is of course an optional thing to do. This is just something that I like to do. So as you can see, I've placed the 3D cursor at the point of the shoulder, and using soft select, I've rotated the arm exactly 45 degrees. And I'm going to repeat that process at the elbow. So reducing my selection using Control- on the keyboard, I'm going to place the 3D cursor at the elbow. But here's a handy little trick. Using the 3D cursor's rotational feature now in Blender 2.8, I'm going to use the 3D cursor's rotational orientation to help aid in the rotation of the forearm. And this is honestly one of the best features that I think Blender has. So I'm changing the Y rotation of the 3D cursor to match the orientation of my arm, which is 45 degrees. And now when I switch the transform orientation to 3D cursor, I get the perfect alignment for my arm to be rotated 45 degrees in the Z space according to the 3D cursor. So now I have a perfectly neutral 45 degree arm in both the bicep and the forearm. And that is just fan-fucking-tastic. So just a little bit of cleanup here and there, just getting those loops looking nice and even up the elbow there and in the armpit. Just a bit of cleanup and then we're good to go on the clothing. So you might be wondering why I'm bothering to even change it to a more neutral pose. Well, a lot of people would say that it's got to do with having a more neutral deformation in the elbows and arms and the shoulders for rigging and deformation. And personally, while that may be true in some cases, for me, it's more to do with total rotation of the arm and the potential for gimbal lock. So if you don't know what gimbal lock is, I suggest you look it up, and it's a bit too complicated to explain in a tutorial that's not about rigging. But essentially it's this: rather than the arm having to rotate 90 degrees from a T pose to a resting walk pose in the arm, it only has to rotate 45 degrees. So that in itself minimizes the potential for gimbal lock in the rotation of the arms. And of course there are trade-offs in that to rotate the arm up above the head, we are effectively increasing the chances of gimbal lock, but the odds of your character really extending their arms up above their head is pretty small compared to, say, a walk cycle or the arms sitting on the side of their body, honestly. So that's just my personal preference. So if there's any actual riggers out there who prefer the T pose over an A pose, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear why you think that way. But judging from the internet, it seems like the debate over that has been around since the dawn of 3D, so who knows. So jumping into the clothing stuff now, as you can see, I have already done the singlet, so I'm going to show you how I approached making her, I guess you can say, kimono, if anything. And the method for creating the singlet was exactly as I'm doing right now. So I'm actually using my original body mesh as a basis for the clothing. So I'm basically just selecting all the faces that I think are necessary to sort of copy to the clothing, and then separating it, or copying it and then separating it to its own mesh. Because why would you bother recreating clothes from scratch when you have a perfectly good base mesh to build from? Other advantages of this method are that you get a perfect contour to the model itself. So That's another advantage there, so no tailoring required with a brand new mesh. Okay, with that duplicated mesh, I am scaling along the normals to just get it off the skin just by a little bit. And then I'm going to delete one half and mirror it so I can start modeling both sides simultaneously as you would expect. And ultimately, if you do have an asymmetrical clothing design, you can still work in mirrored mode up until a point where you are satisfied enough to start playing with the asymmetry. So work out what you need to do with the symmetry first, and then build in that asymmetry once you're at the right stage. And as you can see, I am deleting a few faces that I don't think are necessary for this kimono. So clothing in general has a simpler geometry than, say, the body, because there's less contouring required for it to work. Clothing in general ultimately has zero volume, so it kind of has to be designed in that sense where it's sort of sitting on the underlying body. And unless you're having a super skin tight clothing setup, clothing in general does not wrap around the boobies and the bum. Like, it's not often that jeans will cause a super tight wedgie up the ass crack. So you gotta think about it in that sense. And that's why I am removing the breast tissue volume from the underlying clothing, because it has to sit on top of the breast, not around it. So in a very simple manner, I have just removed the breast face loops and then just simply grid filled in the resulting hole. If you have an uneven amount of spans and are unable to grid fill, choose an appropriate edge loop to delete and then grid fill, because ultimately you will no longer need that odd edge span in clothing like this, because it's no longer required for the structure of the body, unlike the underlying base mesh. So yeah, just take that, smooth it out, and ironically, if you do need to add some extra edge loops, go for it now that you can, and they should flow pretty seamlessly around the body without any issue. Now, depending on what clothing you are designing, you can either start sculpting in some contour around the body, or you can further build upon what you've already got. So in my case, I need to extend out some geometry for the bottom of the kimono. And once I'm done with that, I'll add a couple more edge loops to help fill out that volume there. And then I'll probably end up sculpting it a little bit to fit the contour of the body. And now if you're creating a shirt or something with a lapel like I am with this one, you need to start thinking about the edge flow of the collar and how it flows down to the rest of the jacket or the kimono or the t-shirt that you're working on. So in this case, I need to redirect some edge flow to go around the back of the collar and then down to the bottom of the shirt. So you can see I've redirected some edge flow there so I can get that that smooth transition from the collar down to the breast area. And of course, this is completely up to your design. So if you have a different design and your edge flow needs to be different, you need to think about how you're going to approach that on an individual clothing basis. So it's completely up to you, and I can't give you the silver bullet answer for your particular design. So again, you need to start thinking about the problem solving involved with creating your own efficient edge flow. And if you haven't noticed already, the edge flow here isn't perfect. Right now, some of the spans are traveling up and then into the side of the shirt. So I need to redirect those to flow around the back of the collar. So that's what I'm doing here. So again, a little bit of problem solving involved, choosing how many spans I want to travel around the back, and then merging the appropriate verts to continue those faces to flow around to the back of the body. And that looks pretty good to me. So just a few bits of smoothing and sculpting involved, fix up that back collar, and now you can see those edges are flowing perfectly around to the back of the kimono, and it isn't causing any issues. So more sculpting, more contouring, more aligning with the design of my sketch. Just lining everything up, making sure it's all nice and even. The quads are nicely distributed. So just like the body, you want to make sure that the quads are evenly distributed for the sake of animation. So don't have any really narrow or stretched out quads in your design. And for this particular garment, the rest is history. It's just about me now manipulating what's already there for the most part. I might add a few things here and there in terms of adding some extra edge loops, but ultimately I'm not doing much else to the actual underlying geometry of this kimono. I'm ultimately just trying to align the mesh with my design. And again, this is why having such a strong reference is really important. So, it takes away a lot of the guesswork. So, I know how the cloth is going to fall off the arms. I know how it's going to fall off the hips and the breasts. And ultimately, it just means I don't have to think as much when I'm doing this process. And, you can see here, I'm just duplicating extra meshes for, creating the knots and ties of the kimono. I'm using Bezier curves to work out the loops if I want to have loops in the knots. I'm using any tool I want to get the result I need. Doesn't really matter what I use or what you use, really. It's whatever you find easiest to work with. And ultimately, as long as the underlying geometry is not completely shithouse and unable to be animated or rigged with, then it doesn't really matter what method you use. So here I am just bolting through, making all the straps and lining everything up the way I want it. And again, I'm going through this pretty quickly because, again, if you've managed to get this far into the tutorial series and you've made a body and a face and you've really done a really good job with, the edge flow of those two things, then the clothing shouldn't be all that difficult to problem solve for. The clothing still has to deform in a certain way, depending on how you rig it. It has to articulate with the body as well, as you'd expect it to. And if there's any extra details and stuff, you have to balance your own judgment in terms of whether you want to model in the detail or whether you want to put that detail into the clothing using textures or displacement. And speaking of details, let's talk about adding thickness to the clothing without actually having to model it in. And that's a really simple solution. All you got to do is add a solidify modifier to the clothing in question, and just make sure that it sits above your subdivision surface modifier. That way that when you subdivide the mesh, that the solidification is also smoothed out. And this is the point in which non-destructive systems such as the modifier stack in Blender really shines, because it allows me to adapt and change according to the output that I need for this model. So if I need a lower poly model, all I gotta do is turn off the subdiv and turn off the solidify modifier, and then I got myself a low poly model or a proxy that I can work with when it comes to rigging. And that's another advantage about the modifier stack, especially when it comes to stuff like subdivs and the solidify modifier. Because ultimately, I don't have to weight paint as much when it comes to rigging. If this was a destructive workflow, and I had to skin this jacket to the rig, I would have to actually weight paint both the inside and the outside of the jacket, which would be a total pain in the ass. Now, all I gotta do is put the armature modifier above the solidify and the subdiv, and I'm working with a much simpler mesh when it comes to weight painting. So that's another thing to consider when you're modeling clothes. How are you going to have it animated? So by adding thickness and adding, subdivisions and all sorts of stuff, that will add to the calculation of anything you add on top of that, such as simulation, rigging, and other animation stuff. So again, that's why the modifier stack is so useful, because it bypasses those calculations essentially, as long as you're thinking straight and put that armature modifier on top of any procedural non-destructive effects. Alright, so I'm just trying to sharpen up those edges now, so I can actually add another modifier. In this case, I'm adding a bevel modifier to the edges of the shirt. So using a edge bevel weight value for the edges of the shirt, I'm able to get those corners or edges of the shirt nice and sharp. And this, of course, is a stylistic choice. You don't have to do this. It's completely up to you. And in this case, I'm placing my bevel modifier before my subdivision, but after the solidify modifier. So the solidify modifier will calculate first, then the bevel modifier, and then the subdivision. So that way I'll get that sharp corners on both the inside and the outside of the kimono. And then the subdivision surface will just smooth that out a little bit. So I'm effectively mitigating the amount of performance hit I get from my modeling techniques, because the subdivision modifier is probably one of the most resource intensive modifiers in Blender. And like all things in the 3D modeling world, there is a degree of trial and error, so don't be afraid to experiment with values, see how things work, and play with the feature set that you are given. And another thing about the scale thing I've been talking about or harping on about for almost every video of this series, notice how with the solidify modifier, I'm using a metric value. So the thickness of this object is actually in millimeters, not centimeters, not meters. And that's because the scale of the character is set relatively within real world parameters. Now, if I had made this character with a ridiculous scale and then had to bring it back into a realistic scale and then apply the scale, all the modifiers would fuck up. Suddenly that 5 centimeter thick coat would be 5 centimeters. So it would be going absolutely crazy. It would look like you completely fucked up the model, when in actual fact, the modifier had just been adjusted for the scale. So again, while you're modeling, be aware of those kinds of things. Otherwise, you're going to run into a world of problems. And just like in the previous video with the hair, I'm actually adding some edge creases to certain parts of the clothing. Just trying it out, seeing what works, what doesn't. Because with the stylized vision I have for the clothing, that sort of stuff works just as well on the clothes as it does on the hair. But again, that's completely up to you and your design. Alright, so I've just about wrapped up the kimono part of the clothing, so I'm going to move on to the shorts. And again, in a very similar fashion, I'm going to use my body base mesh as a starting point. So again, with the base mesh in edit mode, I'm going to select the edge loops that I want as the starting point for the shorts. And just as it was before, select it, duplicate, separate, and now you have a separate object. So there's a few things we need to change with this geometry. One is to make sure that these shorts don't look like she has a massive wedgie. No one likes to have a massive wedgie when they're walking around. It's uncomfortable and people are going to look. So yeah, let's fix that shit up. But again, before we do that, we need to expand that geometry a little bit so it's just above the skin. So we're going to scale along the normals, just so it stays above the skin a little bit, just like that. And now we need to remove some of those edge loops around the back of the shorts so it sort of joins up and stretches between the butt cheeks rather than going inside them. So we're going to delete one half of the shorts for now. And then we're going to select the appropriate faces that we need to delete. So in this case, it's that change in direction that formed that butt cheeks, so we don't need that anymore. And we're going to probably just delete up the center as well, so we can get a nice clean join between the two sides. So delete that in this case, and I think that will be right. So now instead of the geometry curving around the shape of the buttocks, we are just going to extend that edge loop so it just wraps around the body. So it's basically another a continuous loop around the circumference of the body. In this case, the shorts, sorry. Fill up those loops where necessary, fill up the holes. And yeah, just like the breasts, just clean up that geometry so we get a nice consistent edge loop flow that isn't accentuating the butt too much. Okay, once you've wrapped up that and filled up any holes that need to be filled, it's time to even out those quads and get us a nice, clean, distributed topology. Smooth out those verts, redistribute those, and make sure it's nice and even. Okay, once you've done all that, you can add a few extra details to the clothing if you want to. In my case, I might add a few like fake stitches down the side of the legs. So, you know, you can see in the design there, the shorts have a little bit of a sort of like a seam along the sides, so I want to add that to the geometry itself. And again, it's not that complicated. I just add a few edge loops down the bottom and on the sides, and then I sort of split the bottom so it has a little bit of a V shape at the bottom there. So I'm basically creating some sort of edge flow that sort of mimics the sort of stitching direction that I want. And again, this is optional. You don't need to do this. I mean, ultimately, I could have done this just with texturing, but I felt I'd give this a go just to see how well it performs when it deforms. So again, optional stuff here. It's up to you with your design. It's up to you how you challenge yourself with your design. So yeah, this is just something that I'm doing for my design only. So again, it's completely up to you. And jumping back into the singlet, actually, I want to add a few of the same sort of details I'm adding to the shorts to the singlet. So some sort of fake stitching. So this is where that whole edge flow thing comes in handy that I talked about at the start of the video. So now I have that stitching, and I'm able to have it travel all the way around to the back of the body. It's really easy to do when you think about the edge flow, even when it comes to the clothing. And that's just about it when it comes to this particular character's clothing design. And obviously, this is not a very complicated clothing design for this character. That being said, it still goes to show you the kind of considerations that you have to give to the modeling process with clothing. So the same things apply as it did with the body. Proper edge flow, having a good plan on how to do it, proper reference, all that sort of stuff matters. And if you have all those things in place, the process becomes a lot less painful. So when you're designing your own clothes and when you're about to build them in 3D, think about those things as much as you did with the face and the body. And I guarantee it, the process will feel a lot less stressful. Also, a lot of artists starting out with this sort of stuff tend to feel like they have to build in all the detail into the mesh itself, when that really isn't the case. I mean, buttons and stuff like that, you can probably model individually depending on what kind of animation you're working on. But stuff like stitching and pockets and all that sort of stuff, you could get away with just texturing that shit in, especially if the character isn't really going to interact with the pockets or anything like that. Just think about how you can save time and make little cheats to make your life easier. Alright, so let's just check this out with a quick little mix animation just for a bit of fun. Ooh, look at her, she's dancing. And again, this is just straight up mix animation, nothing fancy in terms of me actually fixing anything. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the result. And as you can see, it still deforms as you would expect because we've put in those correct edge loops where we need them. And we've done the proper planning and modeling. So no cloth simulation, no nothing. So in the next video, we're going to fix up a few things that we may have missed. So you may have seen it in the video there, the toes and feet. And we're going to do some extra stuff to the body to give you a little bit more flexibility with the model. So until then, catch us and have fun.